we're all here, and I know you're all anxious to hear from Darcy. I'm going to let her take over and give us our presentation, and I really thank you for coming today. It means a lot.
My pleasure. I thank everyone for coming. This is a fantastic crowd. I want to explain what I'm going to do today because it's not the normal way that a candidate might approach this. I'm not going to give you a stump speech today. I will be happy to answer absolutely any questions you have about campaigning, meeting my missions, what I've been doing for the last 3 years. But I wanted to start with a more important discussion. How many of you feel like in the last couple of years, progressives and Democrats have been winning in Washington, D.C.? Your hand is consistent with the response that I've gotten everywhere else I've asked that question. I find that rather frustrating. I would like for us to be winning. And so I spent a bunch of time talking to some of the smartest people in Democratic and progressive politics, looking at the dynamics, trying to, reading history books, trying to pull together an understanding of what it is we're doing wrong. And the reason I thought to approach it this way is actually, as I think some of you know, I started my career as a software developer. I wrote software for Lotus back when Lotus was getting stomped by Microsoft. And I found that incredibly frustrating, because to be perfectly honest, we were writing better software. We were writing better software, it was more stable, it had better features, and it was cheaper. And we were losing the marketplace. And when I went eventually to work for Microsoft, I came to understand that Lotus had been thinking about the problem entirely the wrong way. They had thought if they had better features and a lower price point, people would buy their software. Microsoft, when they were thinking about the problem, said, what's the real driver of what word processor somebody buys? Well, it turns out the biggest driver is can you exchange documents with other people? And so if you can bootstrap to a critical mass of people who are using Microsoft Word, then everybody who has to exchange documents with them will also have Microsoft Word. So they worked inside of large corporations to give them these great deals on lots and lots and lots of licenses for Microsoft Word and Office bundled with it. And then because everyone needed to exchange documents, they won. Lotus was trying to solve the wrong problem. We, Democrats and as progressives, have to some extent been trying to solve the wrong problem. We think if we have better policies, and maybe if we just figure out a better way to talk about those policies, that we're going to win. And that hasn't been working for us. We do have better policies, right? We do have better policies. They are more appealing, they're more sensible, they actually involve real cause and effect. But we're not winning. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what it's going to take for us to win, broadly speaking. And the thing that we're talking about here is power, by which I mean whatever it is you do to get someone else to do what you want them to do. There are lots of ways to do that, but we're going to, very broadly speaking, describe that as power. And by the way, I actually think that having this conversation and really thinking about how we're going to solve this problem is going to be necessary to save our democracy, which means that the subtitle isn't entirely snarky. So when I was growing up, my family had a saying, which is, if you're losing the game, change the rules. The Republicans have internalized this. At every stage of how we exercise power, they have, between about 1974 and now, changed the rules to make it easier for them to win. We're not playing on a level playing field, right? And what that means is we can either decide we're going to change the rules or we can lose. There's no way for us to win in the status quo rule set. The rules are rigged against us. The fight itself, what we're talking about, politics, economics, wars, Fox News, this is all about allocation of power. The right believes that power should be concentrated in the hands of a few supermen distributed. The government should be of, by, and for the people, not some aristocracy. That we should try to make it possible for every person to control as much of their own destiny as possible in very real and meaningful ways. I'm a distributed power person, in case that was ambiguous. Another way to think about it is aristocracy versus democracy, right? We're having this fight again. It's not the first time we've had it, it's not the last time we're going to have it, but that's basically the fight. And I'm going to make an assertion. My assertion is, you can't have functional democracy if too much power of any kind is concentrated in the hands of too few people. So, I'll make that assertion. We can talk about it as we proceed, but keep that in mind, right? I'm not just saying political power, I'm saying any kind of power. You cannot have functional democracy if too much of any kind of power is concentrated in too few hands. All right, so let's talk about, there are 6 different kinds of power, as far as I can tell. Since I made up the list of 6, it's possible I've missed something, and if you all think of another kind of power, you tell me. But so far, 6 types of power. Economic power, who gets what? That's fairly straightforward, we understand that. Political power, who makes the rules. Military or police power, on whom can you enforce your rules, right? Who can you make do what you want to do through the use of force. And economic power and political power are undergirded by military or police power. That's how they're enforced. But there are 3 other kinds of power that are extremely important. Cultural power. What stories do we tell ourselves about who we are? Moral or religious power. What stories do we tell ourselves about who we're supposed to be? And relationship or communication power. Who knows who can we get to listen to us? How far can we reach? So I want to talk for a minute. How many of you have ever had to deal with a small child who did not want to do what you wanted them to do? So there are, broadly speaking, 2 ways that you can make them do what you want them to do, right? 2 basic kinds of power. You can persuade them to do it, or you can physically force them to do it, right? Physical force sometimes works, but it isn't a very good long-term strategy because you can't apply force as a means of getting people to do what you want in any kind of way that's scalable and sustainable over the long term. Persuasion works a whole lot better. Getting people to consent to doing what you want them to do is the only way in the long term to exercise power. These are the consent powers, and these are the force powers. The Republicans right now dominate these 3. We own these 3, and they're more powerful if we actually start exercising them. So, I want to talk for just a minute about each of these types of power individually. And I want to give you a couple of concrete examples, because this is all very nicely abstract, but it makes a lot more sense if we talk about it specifically. Economic power is really straightforward, and you all have no doubt figured out that they've rigged the economic rules so that virtually all of the money in the economy is going into a couple of pockets and all of the rest of us are worse off. I would just observe, and I want you all to understand something, we're not poorer now than we were 10 years ago as a country. The total size of the U.S. economy has doubled in the last 15 years. Every single year, it has grown, without exception. The problem isn't that we don't have money. The problem is that the economic power rules have been rigged so that we don't get that money. And that money goes into, and we can talk in more detail about how they did that and why they did that. But the political power rules are equally rigged. How many people here have heard of Citizens United? So that's an obvious way in which the rules have been rigged. But it isn't the only way. I spent most of the last 3 years working with the Congressional Progressive Caucus in the United States Congress back in D.C., trying to figure out how to make it possible for progressives to actually win occasionally. And what I learned while I was there is that we spend a lot of time as progressives thinking about elections, and we don't spend nearly as much time as we ought to thinking about governing. The governing rules are rigged also. Congress, thank you Newt Gingrich, has been rigged to make it almost impossible to get anything progressive to happen. So if we take, for example, the Senate, funding a program takes 60 votes. Killing a program takes 50.
No, no.
Well, I mean, if it already exists, right, you can kill it with 50 votes, but to actually fund it takes 60. There are all kinds of big and small ways in which they break the rules. So every single year, they have it set up so that the reimbursement rates for doctors in Medicare and Medicaid go off a cliff, right? Everybody knows that's not actually going to happen because doctors wouldn't be able to afford to treat patients, right? So we fix them every year. But here's the thing. Democrats have to spend political capital every single year to keep the status quo. And every time we do that, the Republicans get something in exchange for us simply treading water. When we extend unemployment benefits 2 months at a time, just to keep the status quo, the Republicans get stuff in exchange every single time that comes up. There used to be, so how many people here think lobbyists have too much power in Washington, D.C.? There used to be these internal think tanks in Washington, inside of Congress, where you'd have a couple of staffers, for example, who would focus on nuclear nonproliferation and arms control, or on, veterans issues, or on whatever issue you wanted to focus on. And members of Congress would pool their staffing money, so that you might have 40 or 50 or 60 or 80 members pooling funding for expert staff who could advise them on issues. And that meant anytime you had legislation coming through that had anything to do with the topic at hand, you'd have these experts who advise the members of Congress in great detail about what it was they needed to do. So if some member of Congress had questions about what we ought to actually do about Iran's potential nuclear weapons program, you'd have experts in Congress who would really know the answer to that question. Gingrich, when he took control in January of '95 after the '94 elections, banned shared funding for staff in order to consolidate power in the Speaker's office. What that means is all of the policy work in Congress right now is done by staffers whose average age is 26, who are typically covering 4 to 6 major policy areas each. And if they're lucky, they might understand something about one of those 4 to 6 policy areas. What that means is that when some lobbyist walks in and says, your boss has to take a vote on this bill tomorrow that you know nothing about, here's what you need to know, here are your talking points, here's how your boss should vote, here you go. And that's the only information they get. Of course that's what they're going to tell their bosses to do. It isn't actually that we have Democratic members of Congress who are caving or who are wimps. It isn't that we have staff who aren't trying. It's that the institutional rules are rigged to make it impossible for them to do their jobs. But we can unrig those rules. So when we think about political power, I want you to think about it broadly. It isn't just how we elect people, it's also how we govern. And if, in fact, we ever want to win battles in Congress again, we're going to have to unrig those rules, which, just as an aside, is why I'm running. I'm signing up to fix Congress. Yay. I have a question just out of curiosity, by the way. How many people here think the major problem in Congress is that Democrats aren't willing enough to compromise with Republicans? I was just checking. I was on the radio. We have another person who's just joined the Democratic race, and she said on the radio that she believed that the problem was that Democrats weren't willing enough to compromise with Republicans. I was like, are we living on the same planet? Military or police power, this is fairly straightforward, right? Over whom can you extend your power? The Occupy stuff has actually seen a surprisingly high level of the application of police power. I mean, how many of you saw the video, for example, of the UC Davis students' arms linked sitting on the sidewalk getting pepper spray, right? I mean, that was an incredible video. And that's the 1% attempting to exercise police power to stop something they view as a real threat. And we'll talk in a second about why it's a real threat. Because it isn't an exercise of economic or political power. What Occupy is doing isn't up here, it's down here. Cultural power. The stories that people tell themselves about who they are incredibly important in terms of what they then present to, what they present to, how they behave, what choices they make. So when I was first running in 2006, the Washington State Supreme Court was coming out with a decision on same-sex marriage that had been a court case under the Washington State Equal Protection Clause, which is part of the Washington State Constitution. And nobody knew at the time whether the state Supreme Court was going to decide to mandate same-sex marriage in Washington State or whether they were going to say the Equal Protection Clause didn't apply. But there was polling statewide in 2006. I want you to keep in mind this is only 6 years ago, right, in 2006. And about 42% of Washington State residents thought same-sex marriage ought to be legal. 42%. Now, the state legislature is about to pass a bill making same-sex marriage legal in Washington State. We think, yay! We think that the Republicans will probably kick it to the ballot and we put a ballot initiative. So Equal Rights Washington has done some polling to figure out what the percentage of support for same-sex marriage in Washington State is right now. And it is at 53%. Okay? 6 years, 42% to 53%. That isn't about this. That's about the stories that people tell themselves about who we are. How many of you have ever watched Glee, the television show? So you all know who Kurt Russell is, right? There are a small group of people paid by foundations that are working on LGBT issues who sit in Hollywood and talk to Hollywood writers of the most popular television shows to make sure that almost every major television show on TV today includes really sympathetic, awesome gay characters. And what that means is that everybody thinks they have a gay best friend, whether they do or not. Which is also, it totally changes what's possible. I have an uncle, my mother's brother, Charlie, who everyone in my generation is known for ages. He's gay. He's a confirmed bachelor. He has roommates, right? Of course he's gay, right? But he had not come out to the family. He's got to be, how old is he? In his mid-60s, late, early 70s, right? Somewhere in there. He had not come out to his family until this summer, right? My dad, the first time I ran, was horrified to find out I thought that when two adults fell in love with each other and wanted to live happily ever after, not. I think that was looking whether they were of the same gender or different genders. I didn't care. My dad was horrified. My dad talking to me 2 months ago was like, oh yeah, Uncle Charlie's got a new partner. We're very excited about that. The stories people tell themselves are an incredibly important way that we can exercise. The Mormon Church, how many of you have seen the big ads, I'm a Mormon, big faces, right? The Mormon Church is trying to exercise cultural power right now to change the stories people have in their heads about what it means to be Mormon, right? It is an exercise of cultural power. And I think they're probably going to succeed, at least to some extent, by the way. They'll have to if they want Mitt Romney to have even the slightest chance of winning. Moral or religious power. This is about more than just religion, though in some people's lives religion plays a major role in it. But this is, what stories do we have in our heads about what kind of people we're supposed to be? And the exercise of this power is one of the most powerful things that we can do when we do it right. Though it's very hard to do it right and it's very costly. So during the Civil Rights Movement, when the African-American community in the United States had no economic power, no political power, the police power was rigged against them, cultural power was rigged against them. The only power they had to exercise was moral power. So they did things like they had children getting sprayed by fire hoses and attacked by dogs controlled by the police. And they made sure as many people saw that as possible, because the difference between the stories that people tell themselves about who they're supposed to be and that picture was so stunning that it made people want to fix the problem. The couple of moments that Occupy has been most successful in the last, I mean, it's kind of funny that the movement itself is only like 6 months old. But in the last 6 months, have been moments in which people who clearly come across as sort of inherently innocent, young women, college students sitting peacefully on the ground, an 86-year-old woman in Seattle, doing nothing more dangerous than exercising their right to protest, get attacked by the police, typically by pepper spray, and it gets caught on video and shown to people because the gap between the stories that we tell ourselves about who we're supposed to be as a country and the statement that that makes is so large. Even for, I personally love talking to people who are on the religious right, Christian conservatives, sign me up. Having been raised a good Catholic girl, I've actually read the entire book of Matthew. And I am perfectly to have the debate about what it means when in the red letter text, it says you're supposed to feed the hungry and care for the poor. It doesn't say that there's a difference between the acts you take with your hands and the acts you take with your vote. You're morally culpable for both. So if you choose to act in ways that are inconsistent with the values you espouse, it does not matter how you take those actions. This is a set of arguments that we can win if we're willing to engage. And it doesn't have to be with people who are Christians. It turns out every major religion on the entire planet thinks that increasing the suffering of innocent other people is evil. Every single one. And I find it very funny that every religion on the planet says, essentially, decreasing the suffering of others is the definition of good. Increasing the suffering of innocent others, especially when done for personal gain, is the definition of evil. And we have a political party in the United States for whom that is their governing philosophy. The Republicans think that increasing the suffering of others is a core part of how they go. I mean, the Republicans in D.C. Not Republican voters. My dad's a Republican. He doesn't think that. My dad went to the Republican National Convention in 2008.
Spite?
I'm on the board of Networks Nation, which is the organization that puts together the annual convention for bloggers all over the country, progressive bloggers. Started out as yearly posts, so it's related to dailies. I'm the president of the Networks Nation board. And so I was at Networks Nation this last year presenting, and Right Online does their conference at the same time. And they were doing it in Minneapolis. My dad lives in a small town in Nebraska. And he's like, oh, that's really close to me. I'll come up, I'll see you. I was like, that's great. I'm doing a panel on how we end the war in Afghanistan. My friend General Eaton's going to be talking about it. Why don't you come see my panel? So my dad shows up and he doesn't make it to my panel, and I'm getting all concerned about where he is. Well, it turns out Michelle Bachmann had met it right online. My dad really wanted to meet her. So I was like, Dad. But
you ever talk politics with your dad?
oh yeah, right. And I'm winning him over actually, or I should say the Republicans are losing him. He actually told me about 2 months ago that he's seriously considering switching his party registration, because they register their party in Nebraska, to Democrat. And here's why. Because the Republicans passed a budget that ended Medicare, and they're now actively talking about ending military retirement. And my dad, who is in his early 70s and who served in the United States Air Force for 20 years before becoming a public school teacher and lives off of military retirement, Social Security, Medicare, does not think this is acceptable.